Welcome to Moonlit Bonds from Dusk Chapters. Tonight's fulling story is The Warden of Hollowmere. Settle in, get comfortable, and enjoy. Chapter 1. The dusk came softly over Thistlewick, the way it always did at the fraying edge of Hollowwood, gold light sinking through the pines until the whole sky looked bruised with plum and amber. Marigold Fenwick stood at her work table grinding dried yarrow into powder, and without quite meaning to, she began to hum. It was not a tune she had ever been taught. It rose in her the way breath rose, unbidden, a low winding melody that curled through the cottage like smoke finding a chimney. She caught herself doing it 4 times a day now, always at this hour, always when the light went the color of an old bruise and the shadows under the eaves stretched long enough to touch the door. She did not know where the melody had come from. She only knew that when she hummed it, something in her chest loosened, as though a hand she could not see had settled there and pressed, gently, in thanks. She stoppered the jar of yarrow powder and told herself, as she told herself most evenings, that it did not matter what the villagers said. But it did matter a little. It always mattered a little. There she goes again. Old Hetty Marsh had said to her not 3 days past, loud enough to carry across the market square, humming like her mother did, right before the end. The women near the bread stall had gone quiet and glanced at Marigold sideways, the way they always did, with pity wrapped around suspicion like a cloth around a blade. Marigold had kept her chin level and her basket steady and walked on, because that was what her mother had taught her to do. Walk on, be useful, be kind, let the whispering wear itself out against the stone of your own decency. It was good advice. It had simply never once worked. She banked the fire low and went to check on old Fenner, who lay in the back room with his legs splinted from a fall off his cart, sleeping now with the ragged, grateful breath of a man in less pain than he had been that morning. She touched 2 fingers to his brow out of habit rather than need. No fever. Good. And drew the quilt higher over his shoulder. He would walk again by spring if the bone set true. Her mother's remedies always set bone true, and so, it turned out, did hers. That was the strange gift and the strange curse of being Marigold Fenwick, healer of Thistlewick. Everyone in the village needed her, and almost no one wanted to sit too close to her at supper. She banked out her worries along with the coals and stepped out into the yard for air, wiping her hands on her apron, and there it was again, the pull. It came from the tree line, always from the tree line, where Hollowwood rose up dark and ancient at the border of her mother's old garden, the firs so tall and close-grown that even at midday their shade held a kind of dusk inside it. Marigold had grown up in the shadow of that wood. She had gathered mushrooms and bark and healing roots from its nearer paths since she was small enough to be carried on her mother's hip, and she had loved it the plain, unquestioning way a child loves the ground beneath her own house. But for 8 years now, since the autumn her mother had walked into that wood and never walked out again, found 3 days later at the edge of a clearing with no mark on her and no explanation the village elders would ever give, Marigold had loved the wood with a wariness laid over the loving, like a bandage over a wound that would not quite close. And still, some nights, she stood at the tree line anyway. She stood there now, apron still damp, the cold beginning to needle through her sleeves, and let the last of the light bleed out of the sky. The wood exhaled its evening breath toward her, moss and wet bark and the mineral chill of stone deep under root, and something in her answered it, some small voice at the very back of her, humming that same wordless tune outward into the dark as if the trees themselves might hum it back. Come find what you lost, the feeling seemed to say, though it used no words at all. Come find the name you were given before you were given any other. She did not know what that meant. She had asked herself for 8 years what that meant, standing in this exact spot, and the wood had never once answered plainly. It only watched her, patient as an old friend waiting at a door, while owls woke in the dark above, and somewhere far off, impossibly far, a wolf's cry rose and fell and rose again, lonesome and long, the way it sometimes did on clear nights when the moon climbed early. Hollowmere Pack, the old folk called them, though no villager in living memory had gotten close enough to say more than that. Wolves that kept to the deep wood and troubled no one, the subject of 100 hush stories told to frighten children into staying off the forest paths after dark. Marigold had never feared them the way the others did. If anything, hearing their voices calling across the dark made the ache in her chest ease rather than sharpen, as though whatever called to her from the trees and whatever howled beneath the rising moon were somehow bound together, 2 verses of one long song. She wrapped her arms around herself and did not go in. "You'll catch your death out here," she murmured to no one, an old joke of her mother's, and her own voice sounded strange to her in the hush, thin and young and very alone. She was 23 now, unmarried and, by Thistlewick's reckoning, unmarriageable, too strange, too solemn, too much her mother's daughter, humming songs no one else knew and keeping company with roots and bandages instead of a husband and children. She told herself she did not mind. She had her patience, her garden, the small stone cottage that still smelled faintly of her mother's chamomile even after all these years. It was a good life. It was at least a useful one. But out here, at the tree line, with the wind combing low through the black branches and that unnamed ache pulling taut in her chest like a thread drawn from somewhere deep inside that would straight through to her heart, she let herself admit, just for a moment, that a good and useful life was not always the same as a full one. The wolf's cry came again, closer this time, or seeming closer, threaded through with something that was almost sorrow. Marigold stood very still and listened until the sound died into the wind, and then, because the cold had truly settled into her bones and because old Fenner might wake wanting broth, she turned at last from the trees and went back inside, humming still, without meaning to, all the way to her mother's door. Chapter 2. The storm broke over Thistlewick just after midnight, and it broke badly. Marigold woke to the sound of her shutters slamming against a cottage wall, rain driving sideways in silver sheets, and thunder rolling so close overhead that the jars on her shelf rattled like nervous teeth. She lay still for a moment in the dark, heart hammering, telling herself it was only weather, only the ordinary violence of an autumn sky. But even as she thought it, that same restless thread in her chest gave a hard, sudden pull, as though something out in the wood had cried her name. She lit a candle with hands that were not quite steady, and went to latch the shutter properly before the rain ruined her drying herbs, and that was when she heard it beneath the thunder. Not a howl this time, but something worse. A low, ragged sound, half snarl and half groan, coming from just beyond her garden wall. She should have stayed inside. She knew that, even as she was reaching for her shawl and her mother's old lantern, even as she was easing the door open against the wind. A sensible woman, a properly cautious healer, would have barred the door and waited for morning. But the sound came again, weaker now, threaded with a pain that caught at something old and unguarded in her, and her feet were already carrying her out into the storm before her sense could catch up to stop her. The lantern light swung wild and yellow over the rain-slick grass, and there, slumped against the low stones of her garden wall where the cabbages grew, was a wolf. Not the shape of the wolves that sometimes cross the far pastures at dusk, lean gray shadows gone before you could look twice. This one was enormous, black-furred but for a pale blaze across one shoulder, and even sprawled and shuddering in the mud, he was larger than any beast had a right to be. Dark blood matted his flank in long, raking gouges, for parallel lines torn deep enough that she could see, even in poor light, that no ordinary predator had made them. A bear's claw did not cut so clean. A rival wolf's did not run so straight, so deliberate, as if drawn by something that had wanted very precisely to wound. He lifted his head as her light fell over him, and his eyes were not a beast's eyes at all. They were dark and near human in their exhaustion, fixed on her with an intelligence that made her breath catch, and beneath the pain in them was something that looked almost like recognition. "Oh," she said, foolishly, uselessly into the rain. "Oh, you poor thing." She did not remember deciding to help him. She only remembered kneeling in the cold mud, heedless of her night dress soaking through, and getting her arms beneath the impossible bulk of him, and finding, when she pulled, that he was trying, weakly, gracelessly, but trying, to help her drag him. Between them they got him through the garden gate, and up the 2 stone steps, and over her threshold, and she kicked the door shut behind them against the howling dark and knelt there in the sudden quiet of her cottage, gasping, with a dying wolf bleeding onto her mother's floorboards. "Stay with me," she told him, reaching for the basket of bandages she kept always ready by the hearth. "Whatever you are, stay with me a moment longer." The air seemed to answer her. It happened the way frost forms on a window, so quickly and so strangely that she could never afterwards say she had watched it happen, and yet she had seen every part of it. The black fur seemed to draw inward like smoke pulled through a keyhole. The long lines of the wolf's body folded and lengthened and reshaped themselves with a sound like wind moving through wet leaves, and where a wolf had lain gasping there was, in the space of 3 racing heartbeats, a man. He was powerfully built, broad through the shoulder and dark-haired, sprawled half across her hearthstones in nothing but the rain that still clung to his skin, and the same 4 claw marks that had scored the wolf's flank scored his now, raw and bleeding across his ribs. He made a low, terrible sound of pain and pressed a hand against the wound, and his dark eyes found hers again, still lucid, still watching her as though she were the only fixed point in a spinning world. "You're hurt," Marigold said, which was foolish, because of course he was hurt. She could see that plainly, but her mind had gone somewhere strange and thin with shock, and it was the only thought that would form itself into words. "Bandages," he managed, his voice a rough scrape, "before I bleed out on your floor and give you a worse fright than I already have." Something in her steadied at that, some old healer's instinct surfacing through the astonishment like a hand finding a familiar rail in the dark. She had bound 100 wounds. She did not need to understand what she had just seen to know what needed doing now. She snatched clean linen and her mother's stitching needle and the little pot of yarrow salve, and she knelt beside him on the hearthstones, and she set her hands to the long tears in his side. The moment her fingers touched his skin, warmth poured through her. It was not the ordinary warmth of nearness to another body, not the simple heat of his fevered blood beneath her palms. It came from somewhere deeper, welling up through her chest like moonlight poured slow and liquid into her very bones, spreading outward from her heart until her fingertips tingled with it, until the ache that had lived unnamed in her chest for as long as she could remember gave one long, singing pull and then, astonishingly, went quiet, as though something that had been reaching for years had finally closed its hand around what it sought. She gasped and went still, needle forgotten in her fingers. The man beneath her hands had gone rigid too. His breath caught sharply, and when she looked up, startled, she found his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression that was not pain at all now, but something far more naked, shock and wonder and a kind of desperate, disbelieving recognition, as if he had been struck by the same impossible warmth and knew, where she did not yet, exactly what it meant. "What?" he breathed, so low she almost lost it beneath the drumming rain on the roof. "Is your name?" "Marigold," she said, because it seemed the only steady thing left to hold on to, her own name in her own mouth. "Marigold Fenwick." He said nothing more for a long moment, only looked at her as though she were something he had stopped believing in and had just, against all sense, been proven wrong about. Then his eyes fluttered, pain dragging him back down, and he let his head fall against the hearthstones with a low groan. "Marigold," he repeated roughly, like a man testing whether a word could hold his whole weight. "Then bind the wound, Marigold Fenwick, before I fall unconscious in your cottage, and you have no name at all to curse me by." She almost laughed, startled into it despite the blood and the rain and the impossible shifting shape of the night. She bent back to her work, hands steadier now though her heart was not, and did not let herself look too long at the strange, silvery mark she thought she glimpsed beneath the torn collar of his skin, pale as moonlight, half hidden in shadow, because there was no time yet to wonder at it, only to stitch and to staunch, and to keep this stranger's blood inside his body until the storm outside had spent its fury and the tether now singing taut between their hearts had a chance to explain itself. Chapter 3. The pain came in waves after that, and each time it crested, he gritted his teeth and let her work, though his body strained with the effort of holding still under her hands. Marigold moved with the practiced calm her mother had drilled into her since childhood, cleaning the deep gashes along his ribs, packing them with yarrow and the crushed leaves of woundwort, murmuring small useless comforts the way she did for every frightened creature that came to her door, though she had never in her life stitched flesh that had, moments before, worn fur. "You're doing that on purpose," he said through his teeth, when her fingers pressed firm against a wound to stop its bleeding. "Talking to me like I'm a spooked colt." "You are being remarkably like a spooked colt," she said, not looking up from her work. "Perhaps if you stopped thrashing every time I touch you, I could finish before dawn." A huff of breath escaped him that might, in a less battered man, have been laughter. She glanced up despite herself and found him watching her, his dark eyes bright with pain and something else beneath the pain, something quieter and more searching, as though he were trying to read a language he had only half learned. She had tended enough frightened men and women in her healing years to know the particular way people looked at a person who had just saved them. This was not quite that. This was something that looked disquietingly like recognition. "You never gave me your name," she said, mostly to fill the silence, and because her hands needed something steady to hold to while the rest of her reeled. "Corvin." He said it plainly, without embellishment, the way a man might set down a single coin and call it payment enough. "That will do for tonight." "Only Corvin?" "For tonight," he said again, and something in his voice closed the door on further questions gently enough that she did not push it further, not yet, not with his blood still slicking her hands and the rain still hammering the shutters like something demanding to be let in. She worked in silence after that, and he let her, though she was aware, achingly, strangely aware, of every place her fingers rested against his skin. It was not merely the intimacy of nursing a stranger, of pressing linen to a hard chest still rising and falling too fast. It was that each point of contact seemed to hum, low and warm, like a plucked string finding its note. She told herself it was exhaustion. She told herself it was fright, the lingering shock of watching a wolf become a man on her own hearthstones. But when she reached to draw the torn edges of his shirt aside to check a wound higher on his shoulder, and her palms settled briefly against his collarbone, the hum became something closer to song, and she snatched her hand back before she could stop herself. Corvin's breath caught. She thought, for one unsteady moment, that she had hurt him, "Forgive me," she said. "I didn't mean." "You didn't," he said, low. He was looking at her now with an intensity that made the small cottage feel smaller still, made the firelight seem to lean in around them like something curious. "You didn't hurt me at all." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing and busied herself instead with folding a fresh length of cloth, though her hands were not quite steady enough to make the corners meet. When she looked up again, he had let his head fall back against the hearthstones, eyes half closed, watching her from beneath dark lashes with an expression she could not name, tender and wary at once, like a man watching something precious that he did not yet trust himself to reach for. "You have a healer's hands," he said finally, quietly, as though it cost him something to say it lightly. "Gentle enough to fool a body into forgetting it's afraid." "My mother had gentler ones," Marigold said, and was surprised at the small ache that rose with the words, old and familiar as an unhealed bruise. "I'm told I take after her, though I never quite believed it." Something shifted in his face at that, some flicker, quickly hidden, that might have been surprise, or might have been recognition. But before she could ask what had put it there, his shirt, torn already beyond saving, slipped further open at the movement of his shoulder, and the firelight fell full across his collarbone. Marigold went still. There, pale against his skin, was a mark she had first glimpsed only in shadow and rainlight and had told herself she imagined. A small, silvery shape, like a crescent moon cradling a single closed eye, its lines fine as though drawn by a needle dipped in starlight rather than ink. It was not a scar. It did not sit atop the skin the way a scar did, raised and puckered with old hurt. It seemed to come from beneath it, glowing faintly even now, banked like an ember that had not quite gone to ash. She knew that mark. She had seen it every day of her life, tucked beneath the cuff of her sleeve, dismissed by her mother once, long ago, as a birthmark and nothing more, not worth the asking. She had stopped asking. She had almost stopped seeing it at all, the way one stops seeing any familiar thing worn close to the body for years. Without quite deciding to, she reached up and drew back her own sleeve, baring the inside of her wrist. The same mark lay there, small and silver and unmistakable, catching the firelight exactly as his did, as though the two marks were halves of a single broken coin now, at last, being held near enough to remember each other. Corvin went utterly still. Even his breathing seemed to pause, and the wildness of pain that had been etched into his face for the better part of an hour fell away, replaced by something far more naked, a stunned, unguarded wonder that made him look, for a moment, much younger than she had first taken him for, and much more afraid. "Where?" he said, and his voice had dropped to barely more than a breath, urgent and low. "Did you get that mark?" "I don't know," Marigold said, and found her own voice unsteady to match his. "I've had it since I was small. My mother said it was nothing. A birthmark. She never—" She stopped, because his eyes had not left her wrist, and because some instinct older than reason told her that whatever answer he was listening for mattered more than anything she had said to him all night. "Why? What is it?" He did not answer at once. He only looked at her, and then at the mark, and then at her face again, as though he were assembling her, piece by piece, into someone he had been searching for without knowing her name, and had stopped believing he would ever find. Outside, the storm had begun, at last, to soften, its fury spending itself against the thatch in a slower, gentler rain, and in the quiet that followed his silence, Marigold heard her own heartbeat, and beneath it unbidden, the low answering thrum of his. "Marigold Fenwick," he said at last, very quietly, as though testing the shape of a truth he was not yet ready to speak whole. "I think you had better sit down. I have a great deal to tell you, and I find, now, that I do not know where a man is meant to begin. Chapter 4. Marigold sat, because he had asked her to, and because her knees had gone strangely unreliable beneath her, and she listened while the rain gentled itself against the thatch, and the man who called himself Corvin told her, in a low and careful voice, that he was no wandering hunter caught out in a storm, but the alpha of a pack that kept the deep heart of Hollowwood, and that the mark at her wrist was no birthmark at all, but the sign of a bond that bound one soul to another beyond any breaking she had ever heard named in a village tale. She did not scream, or faint, or send him back out into the wet dark as perhaps a more sensible woman would have done. She only sat very still, turning the strange new shape of the world over in her mind the way she might turn a stone found in a riverbed, looking for the seam that would tell her what it truly was, and when at last she spoke, her voice came out steadier than she felt. "And what am I to you, then, if I carry the twin of it?" Something moved behind his eyes, quick and unguarded, gone before she could name it. "Everything," he said, and then seemed almost startled by his own honesty, and looked away into the banked coals as though the fire might tell him how to soften what he had just admitted. "Forgive me. I have known you the better part of an evening. I ought not to say such things. You bled on my floor the better part of an evening," Marigold said, "and I have already forgiven you worse than honesty." That won her the ghost of a smile, the first she had seen on him unshadowed by pain, and something in her chest turned over softly to see it. He should have gone, she thought, once his wounds had closed enough to bear the walk, once the right of it, whatever bond it truly was, had been spoken aloud and could no longer be pretended away. A wiser man, or a more disciplined one, might have thanked her plainly and taken his leave before the village woke to find a stranger's boots drying by a healer's hearth. But Corvin lingered through that night and into the gray hush of morning, finding one reason after another to stay a little longer. The rain had not fully let up, he said, and then that his legs still pulled strangely when he set weight on it, and then, when even he seemed to hear how thin his excuses had worn, he simply stopped making them, and looked at her instead with a helplessness that made her laugh outright for the first time in longer than she could remember. "You are not very good at leaving," she told him. "I am told," he said gravely, "that I have never had reason to be good at it before." It was near midday, with pale sun finally breaking thin and gold through the clearing clouds, when he made his offer, standing a little too straight in her doorway, as though bracing for refusal. His pack, he said, owed her a debt no polite word could properly discharge, and it was neither right nor wise to let it go unpaid. Let her come to Hollowmere, to the lodge in the deep wood, and be thanked as she deserved, with fire and food and the pack's own honor, before he escorted her home again by nightfall. Put so plainly, it sounded almost ordinary, the kind of small errand a healer might make to any neighboring hall. It was not ordinary at all, and both of them knew it. No one from Thistlewick walked into the wood on a wolf's word, and came back the same in the telling. Old Hetty at the mill would call it madness before Marigold had even cleared the garden gate, and Marigold, weighing the offer against a lifetime of careful, watched behavior meant to keep her safe from exactly this sort of gossip, found that she did not care, not truly, not when the alternative was watching him walk back into the trees and never learning what waited on the other side of that pull beneath her ribs. "Yes," she said, before caution could argue her out of it. "I'll come." Word of it moved through Thistlewick faster than the storm had. By the time she had banked her hearth and told Widow Pruitt, in the mildest voice she could manage, that she would be away from the village overnight on healer's business, 3 separate neighbors had already found reason to stand in her doorway with faces arranged into careful, worried concern that did not quite hide the hunger for scandal beneath it. She bore it as she bore most things said behind hands at dusk, with a polite nod and a closed door, and told herself it did not matter what Thistlewick whispered, though some small, tender part of her ached anyway at being, once again, the healer who did not quite fit the shape of her own village. The wood at evening was nothing like the wood she thought she knew. She had walked its fringes 100 times, gathering root and bark, always careful to keep the last light of the village at her back. But walking beside Corvin, she went deeper than she had ever dared, past the old crooked oaks and down a deer track silvered with rising moonlight, until the trees opened all at once upon a clearing ringed with lodge fires, and Marigold stopped where she stood, forgetting entirely to be afraid. Firelight moved gold and amber across dozens of faces, some human, some not quite, children weaving between the legs of their elders in games too quick for her eye to follow, an old woman laughing over a pot that smelled of rosemary and riverfish, 2 young men wrestling good-naturedly at the fire's edge, while a ring of onlookers called encouragement. Somewhere a low, rough song was rising, half-hummed, half-howled, and it caught at something in her chest so like the ache she felt at dusk over her own garden wall that her breath went thin. This was what she had been listening for, she realized, all those lonely evenings at the tree line. Not the wood itself, but this warmth gathered against the dark and held. "They will not bite," Corvin said, low, at her shoulder, and there was real warmth beneath the dry humor of it. "Mostly. Comforting," she murmured, and let him lead her forward into the firelight, where the pack's welcome closed around her, curious and unguarded, hands offered and names given freely, as though a healer from the village were the most natural guest in the world to bring to a wolf's own hearth. Not everyone welcomed her so easily. A tall, hard-eyed man with a beta's bearing stood apart from the fire's warmest circle, arms folded, watching her with an attention that had nothing of welcome in it. Corvin introduced him as Idris, his beta and oldest friend, and Idris inclined his head with correct, chill courtesy and then began, gently enough at first, to ask her questions, where she had been raised, how long her family had kept to Thistlewick, what her mother had done before her, and whether that mother, too, had walked so easily into the deep wood at a stranger's asking. "My mother died in this wood," Marigold said, quietly, and watched something flicker and go still behind Idris's eyes, gone too fast to read, before he murmured a correct, cool apology and let the questions drop, though he did not stop watching her, not once, for the rest of that long and firelit night. Chapter 5. Autumn folded itself deeper into Hollowwood in the days that followed, gilding the bracken and rattling the last stubborn leaves loose from the oaks, and Marigold found herself, again and again, walking the path from Thistlewick to the lodge clearing as though her feet had learned it long before her mind agreed to the journey. She told herself it was only sensible to see how Corvin's wounds were healing. She told herself the same thing on the 3rd day and the 5th, and did not entirely believe it by the 7th, when she caught herself humming that same nameless, dusk-born melody all the way there and blushed to realize it. Corvin met her at the tree line each time, as though he had simply known she was coming, and perhaps he had. He never said and she never asked, content to let it sit between them as one more small mystery in a world that had lately filled with them. He walked beside her under the pines with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, careful, she thought, to leave a small proper distance between their shoulders, though it seemed to cost him something to keep it there. "You are doing that thing again," she told him one gray afternoon, when the light came down thin and silver through the branches, and their breath showed pale in the cold. "What thing?" "Walking as though you are escorting a duchess to supper instead of a healer up a muddy hill." She hitched her skirts over a root and did not take the hand he offered, mostly to see what he would do with it, and was rewarded by the faint, helpless huff of a laugh he tried and failed to smother. "Forgive me. I am told wolves have very poor manners, and I am compensating." "You are compensating for something," she agreed, "though I have not decided what." "Careful, healer. I have claws." "I have stitched worse than claws out of drunker men than you," she said serenely, and he laughed outright this time, a warm, startled sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it delighted her, and she found she wanted, quite badly, to hear it again. It became, without either of them naming it, a kind of courtship conducted entirely in the safe language of teasing, in shared bowls of stew eaten by the lodge fire while old hunting stories were traded around them, in the small competitive game of who could name more herbs growing along the path, in the way he always found some excuse to walk on the side of her nearer the drop of the hill, as though a healer who had walked that path her whole life might suddenly forget how her own feet worked. She noticed the way his gaze softened on her when he thought she was occupied with something else. She did not let herself examine too closely why she noticed, or why some unnamed thing in her chest turned warm and quiet whenever it happened, like a hearth banked low but never quite out. It was old Sable who broke the pleasant spell of it, on an evening when the pack elder had settled beside Marigold at the fire to press a cup of something bark-bitter and warming into her hands, her white braid catching gold in the firelight, her eyes sharp despite the stoop of her shoulders and the slow care of her walk. "You've a fine hand with that poultice you left for my knees," Sable said, by way of beginning, and patted Marigold's arm companionably, and then her fingers found the hem of Marigold's sleeve where it had ridden up in the warmth of the fire and stilled. Marigold followed her gaze down to her own wrist, to the thin silvery mark that lived there, half-moon and strange, the one she had carried all her life and never once explained, the one that had gone warm and answering the moment she first touched the mark at Corvin's collarbone. She had grown so used to keeping it covered before strangers that she had forgotten, sitting easy by this fire, to do so now. Sable did not let go of her wrist. Her face, weathered and calm a moment before, went the color of old ash. "Where," Sable said very low, "did you come by that mark, child?" "I was born with it. My mother had one like it, though smaller, on her collarbone." Marigold's pulse had begun to climb, some old instinct in her recognizing danger in the elder's stillness before her mind caught up to why. "Why, Sable, what is it?" Around the fire, conversation had not stopped, but Corvin had gone very quiet where he sat, and when Marigold glanced at him, she found him already watching Sable with an intensity that had nothing lazy left in it at all. "Say her name," Sable said. "Your mother's name. Say it aloud. Here, by this fire, where the wood can hear it." "Ivy," Marigold said, bewildered. "Ivy Fenwick." Something in the old woman seemed to give way at that. Some held breath finally let loose, and she pressed both weathered hands to her mouth for a moment before she found her voice again. "Fenwick," she breathed. "I had thought that line ended in the wood with her. I had hoped it, some days, and grieved it on others, and never thought to see it walk back into my firelight wearing her face and her mark both." Sable. Corvin's voice, when he spoke, was gentle, but did not invite delay. "Tell us plainly." The old woman looked between them both, the healer and her alpha, and something like an old grief and an old relief moved together across her face. "Long before any wolf now living drew breath," she said, "before even my grandmother's grandmother ran these hills, Hollowwood was not the gentle place you know. It was wild in a way that ate wolves whole, shifts that would not turn back, moon madness with no dawn to break it, packs torn apart from the inside by their own wildness. It was human hands that bound it quiet, a line of wardens, born to carry the old magic in their blood the way we carry the wolf in ours, who set stones through the deep wood and sang the wildness into sleep, generation after generation, so that our kind could live here as we do now, as neighbors to the wood instead of prey to it. And my mother was the last of that line to walk among us, so far as I ever knew, though she never claimed the name outright, and I never pressed her for it. May the moon forgive my silence. Sable's hand tightened, briefly, painfully, on Marigold's wrist. The wardstones have been failing, child. Slowly, these last years, a crack here, a silence there. Nothing we could not bear alone. But of late it has worsened. Wolves losing themselves mid-shift with no moon and no cause, caught somewhere between man and beast and unable to find their way back to either. We have taken to calling it the Grey Wither, for want of a kinder name, and it is spreading. The fire cracked and settled. Somewhere beyond the clearing a wolf's cry rose, ragged at its edges in a way that no longer sounded merely mournful to Marigold's ear, but afraid. "You're saying," Marigold said slowly, the warmth of the evening gone cold and strange around her, "that the mark on my wrist is not only my mother's, but a duty she never lived to hand down to me." Sable did not look away from her. "I am saying, child, that Hollowwood has been waiting a very long time to call you by your proper name," she said, "and that I do not think it means to wait much longer." Chapter 6. The journal was exactly where Marigold remembered it, at the bottom of her mother's cedar chest beneath a folded shawl that still smelled faintly of dried lavender and wood smoke. Its cover was plain brown leather gone soft with handling, and its clasp had rusted shut years ago, so that when she finally worked it open with a hairpin her hands were trembling not from the effort, but from something closer to grief. She had not opened this chest since the year her mother died. She had told herself, in all that time, that she was not ready. Now she understood it had never been readiness she lacked, only a reason large enough to outweigh the fear. Corvin waited by the cottage door while she knelt over the chest, giving her that quiet space he seemed to know how to give without her ever having to ask for it. And when she finally lifted the journal free and turned to him, he crossed the room and settled beside her at the small table without a word, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, near enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him like sun-warmed stone. "You do not have to stay for this," she said, though she did not mean it, and by the small knowing curve of his mouth she suspected he heard the truth beneath the words as easily as she had. "I am not leaving you to read your mother's ghost alone," he said simply, and that was the end of the matter. The first pages were ordinary enough, recipes for fever tonics, notes on which roots grew sweetest near the old stream bend, a pressed sprig of yarrow gone brittle and pale with age. But further in, the hand changed, grew smaller and more careful, as though her mother had been copying something precious rather than composing it, and the words themselves slid into a cadence Marigold had never seen written down, though something in her chest recognized it all the same, low and old, like a tune hummed to her before she had words to hold it with. "Chance," Corvin murmured, leaning closer to study the looping script. "Warding chance. Look here, this line repeats. Root and river, bone and bough." He touched the page, careful not to smudge the faded ink. "That is old wolf tongue, or near enough to it. We do not use it any more, not since before my grandfather's grandfather ran this wood." "My mother knew it," Marigold said, wonder and unease tangled together in her voice. "She used to hum something like it at dusk. I thought it was only a lullaby." "Perhaps it was both," Corvin said gently. "A ward can be a lullaby, too, if it is old enough and loved enough." They worked through the evening by candlelight, Marigold reading the chant lines aloud in a halting whisper, while Corvin supplied what fragments of the old tongue he still remembered from pack lore, the two of them piecing together meaning the way one might piece together a shattered pot, patient over each shard. Rite of binding, the pages said. Blood given, not blood taken. The warden stands between the wood and the world, and what she gives whole. There were diagrams, too, rough sketches of standing stones arranged in a loose ring, their positions marked with small notations in her mother's hand. Worn thin, this one, and listing badly, and silence in spring. The last words underlined twice as though written in a hurry or in fear. These are real places, Corvin said slowly, studying the sketch. I know this ring. We call it the Old Shrine Stones now, though no one remembers why. It lies deep in the wood, past the Heart Grove. He looked up at her, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. I did not know they ward stones. I do not think anyone living knows that anymore, save perhaps Sable, and even she did not have this. Will you take me there? Marigold asked. Tonight? He studied her a long moment, and she thought he might refuse, might tell her it was too late, too dark, too much to carry after a day already so heavy with revelation. Instead, he only rose and held his hand out to her, and she took it, and did not let go the whole walk through the trees. The moon was near full and generous with its light, silvering the path so that the wood did not feel so much dark as hushed, holding its breath around them. The shrine stones, when they reached them, stood in their broken ring like old teeth in a jawbone crooked with age, moss-throated and canted, several fallen entirely into the bracken. And yet even ruined, even silent, there was a weight to the place, a stillness that pressed against Marigold's skin like the moment before a held note finally breaks. She laid her palm flat against the nearest stone and felt, faint as a heartbeat through a closed door, something answer beneath her hand. It knows me, she whispered. Of course it does, Corvin said, low, from just behind her shoulder. You are what it has been waiting for. She turned, and he was closer than she expected, close enough that the moonlight caught the silver threading through his dark hair and the quiet, unguarded look on his face, a look she had seen flicker at the edges of him before and watched him smooth away each time, as though he did not trust himself to let her see it whole. He did not smooth it away now. Corvin, she said, and did not know herself what she meant to say after his name, only that it needed saying. I have run from a great many things in my life, he said, storms and blades and grief. I did not think I would ever stand still for one. His hand came up, slow enough that she could have stepped back, and did not, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek with a tenderness that undid her more thoroughly than any embrace. I am done running from this. I do not think it was ever chasing you, she said softly. I think it was only ever waiting, the way the stones waited, the way I did not know I was waiting, until you fell against my garden wall, and I felt my whole life tilt toward you. He made a low sound, not quite a laugh, more like relief given breath, and then his arms were around her and hers around him, and the ruined shrine stones stood witness as she tipped her face up and he bent his down, and the kiss that followed was unhurried and certain, moonlight pouring over them both like something poured out in blessing. Neither said the word bond aloud. Neither needed to. It sat between them now, spoken in the press of his mouth to hers, in the way her hands curled into the front of his shirt, as though she might otherwise drift loose from the earth entirely. They did not hear the wood shift. Far off, on the ordinary side of the tree line, Idris crouched at the edge of the bonfire's light, murmuring low to a knot of younger pack wolves who leaned in uneasy to catch his words. Mark her wrist all you like, he was saying, soft and reasonable, the way Rod is reasonable in a beam no one has thought to test. The failing did not begin until she came among us. I am not saying she means us harm. I am only saying the wood does not lie, and the wood has been dying a little more each day since a stranger's blood came walking into it. He let the silence stretch, let the fire crack and the doubt take root where he had planted it. Someone ought to say it, since our Alpha will not. Chapter 7. The Greywither came without the courtesy of warning, the way all true dangers did. It began as an ordinary afternoon, sun slanting gold through the last high leaves of hollow wood, the kind of light that made Marigold think the world might, after all, be mending itself. She had walked partway to the village that morning to check on old Fenner's cough, and had lingered at the tree line on her way back, watching a young pack wolf named Bram loping along the ridge above Thistlewick, hurting nothing in particular, simply glad, it seemed, to be young and fast and alive. She had smiled at the sight of him. She would remember that smile later, and how little it had cost her to give it, and how much she would have given to take it back and press it instead into a warning. It was Bram who broke first. She heard it before she understood it, a sound like a bone changing its mind, wet and wrong, carried down the wind from the ridge, followed by a cry that started as a boy's shout and ended, horribly, as a wolf's scream. By the time she reached the village road, gathering her skirts and running though every instinct pulled her a healer ought never to run toward the thing that frightened her, Bram was neither wolf nor boy, but some caught and suffering thing between, for rippling into skin and back again across his shoulders, his eyes rolling white, his hands, when they were hands, clawing at his own face, as though he could tear the wrongness out of himself. Farmer Aldous Crane had been driving his cart in from the low fields. He never had a chance to understand what he was looking at. Bram's flailing arm, half foreleg and half fist, caught him across the ribs and threw him from the cart seat into the ditch, and the horse screamed and bolted, and the whole ordinary world of the village road came apart in the space of 3 heartbeats. Corvin was there before Marigold's mind had even finished shouting his name in her thoughts, a gray blur down the ridge and into the road, shifting as he ran so that he came up out of his own change, already reaching for Bram with human hands, murmuring something low and steady that Marigold could not hear, but that she watched work on the boy like a hand pressed to a wound. It took long minutes, minutes in which half of Thistlewick gathered white-faced at their doorways, minutes in which a woman screamed for someone to fetch a rifle before her husband dragged her back inside. But at last Bram went still and human and sobbing in Corvin's arms, and the danger, such as it had been, was over. The damage it left behind was not. Marigold knelt in the ditch grass over Aldous Crane, her hands finding the break in his ribs with the ease of long practice, binding what could be bound, murmuring the small foolish comforts a body in pain needed more than it needed truth. Around her the village had gone the particular quiet of a place deciding, all at once, what it believed. She felt their eyes on her back like a second wound. She had felt village eyes on her before, for her mother's death, for her humming, for the general unlikeliness of a healer who kept to herself. But this was different. This was fear with a shape now, and the shape had claws. The pack council was called before the sun set. She had never stood inside the ring of elders before, only at its edges, welcomed and unwelcome both, and she felt the difference of it now in the way the firelight seemed to hold itself back from her. Sable sat closest to the flames, her old face drawn tight with worry rather than judgment, and Corvin stood at the center of the circle with Bram's trembling account still fresh in the air, and for one held breath Marigold let herself hope that grief and relief together might be enough to close the matter. Then Idris stepped into the firelight, and she understood that hope had been foolish. 3 wolves lost to the Greywither this month, he said, and his voice carried the terrible gift of sounding reasonable even as it drew blood. Tonight it nearly cost a young pack brother his mind, and it cost an innocent farmer his ribs, and by grace alone it cost no one their life. I do not say this lightly, Alpha. I have said nothing lightly since the wood began to sicken. But I will not stand in council and pretend I do not see what every wolf here sees. He turned, slow and deliberate, until his gaze found her where she stood at the circle's edge. The failing began when she came among us. A murmur ran the circle, low as wind through dry grass, and Marigold felt it move through her like a splinter working deeper. She has done nothing but heal, Corvin said, and though his voice was quiet, it silenced the murmur outright, the way a struck bell silences smaller sounds. She bound Bram's father's hand not 2 winters past, when none of you would touch a wound gone that foul. She sat with old Wren through her dying and asked nothing for it. You would name her a curse for the crime of kindness. I would name her a stranger with a warden's mark and a dying wood, and ask why those 2 facts trouble no one but me, Idris said. The wardstones have failed before in living memory, and never before has a human walked among us carrying magic none of us can name. I do not say she means harm. I say the wood does not care what she means. I say we send her back beyond the tree line until the wardstones are whole again, for her safety and ours both, and I ask this council to stand with me in saying it. He did not shout it. That was the worst of it, Marigold thought. That he said it gently, reasonably, the way one might recommend closing a window against a coming storm, so that agreeing with him cost nothing, felt like nothing but prudence. She watched the faces around the fire, wolves she had begun, these past weeks, to think of as almost her own. Young Idony, who had laughed with her over the mending of a torn cloak, old Garrick, who had thanked her twice for salve, and she saw it there, unmistakable even in firelight. Doubt, flickering up like a coal catching, in eyes that had been warm to her only that morning. It struck her harder than Idris's words had. She had known distrust before. She had not known, until this moment, how much she had let herself believe she'd earned its opposite. Corvin's gaze never wavered from her, not once, not even to weigh the council's mood, and in that steadiness she found the only ground that did not shift beneath her. She stays, he said, and there was nothing gentle in it now, only the flat iron certainty of an alpha's word. The wardstones failed before she came here. Sable herself will tell you the rot in them is older than her arrival, older than mine. If any wolf in this circle believes otherwise, let them bring me proof instead of fear dressed as caution. Until then, Marigold Fenwick is under my protection, and this council's business tonight is done. He did not raise his voice, and still it landed like a verdict. The fire cracked. No one spoke against him again, not aloud, not there. But as the circle broke and the wolves drifted back toward the lodge in 2s and 3s, Marigold caught the backward glances, quick and uneasy, and understood that Idris had not lost tonight so much as planted something that would keep growing in the dark, unseen, the way rot always did, until someone thought to test the beam. Chapter 8. The lodge had long since gone quiet around her, the fire banked to embers, the last low voices of the pack fading toward sleep, but Marigold sat cross-legged on the floor of the small room Corvin had given her, her mother's journal open across her knees, and she did not feel the hour at all. She had read the same page perhaps a dozen times, as if enough reading might soften what it said, might turn it into something else. It did not change. The ink, faded to the brown of old blood, held its meaning with a stubbornness that felt almost cruel. The wardstones are not stone alone, her mother had written, in the careful, slanting hand. Marigold had grown up watching bent over ledgers of herbs and remedies, never once suspecting what else that hand had recorded. They are memory made solid, and memory fades unless it is fed. A warden does not merely chant the binding. She gives it what chanting cannot, her own life, drawn from her at the heart grove and poured into the failing stones freely, or the right will not take. I do not know what is left of a woman after such giving. I have never dared ask whether anyone has lived to describe it. Marigold had turned the page hoping for a gentler continuation, some reassurance her mother had surely meant to write for a daughter she must have known, even then, might someday need these words. There was none, only a single line, added later, in a shakier version of the same hand. If it comes to my daughter, let her know I would have spared her this, if the wood had let me. She pressed her fingers to her mouth and sat very still, listening to her own heartbeat, which seemed suddenly very loud and very fragile, a small drum she had never before had cause to count. She thought of the young wolf on the village road, of his eyes gone wide and empty midshift, of the farmer's cry and the terror in it. She thought of Sable's face by the fire, gray with old grief. She thought, longest of all, of Corvin, of the iron in his voice before the council. She stays, and of what it would cost him, what it would break in him, to learn what the wood truly asked in exchange for its mending. If she told him, he would forbid it. She knew this the way she knew her own name. He would gather every wolf in Hollowmere between her and that grove before he let her walk into it carrying her life, like an offering. And the grey wither would not wait out his stubbornness. Already it was spreading faster than Sable's oldest remedies could slow it. Already more wolves flickered at the edges of themselves each night the moon rose. There was no time left to be loved carefully. There was only time to act. She wrote no note. She could not trust her hand not to shake, could not trust herself not to soften it into something he might use to follow her and stop her before it was done. She only rose, wrapped her shawl close against the night's chill, and slipped out past the sleeping lodge like a woman walking in her own dream, the journal tucked against her heart as though it might anchor her to the courage she was borrowing from it. Hollowwood at that hour was a different country than the one she had walked by daylight. The moon hung high and near full, silvering the black trunks, and every shadow between them seemed to breathe. She followed the path Sable had once shown her toward the heart grove without needing to think of it, as though her feet remembered a way her mind had never learned, blood calling to blood, the wood recognizing its own. The grove opened before her at last exactly as her mother's pages had described it, and no fear could have prepared her for the wrongness of it. Once it must have been beautiful, a ring of pale standing stones cradling a hush of moss and starlight. Now the moss had blackened at its edges, curling like burnt paper, and a sickly gray mist pooled low around the stones' feet, seeping from cracks that ran through them like old scars reopened. The air smelled of cold ash and something underneath it, something rotten and patient, waiting to be noticed. Marigold knelt at the center of the ring, laid the journal open on the stone before her, and began, in a voice that trembled only at the first word and then steadied, to speak the chant her mother had written there in a script that was not quite words and not quite song. She drew the small blade from her satchel, the one Sable had pressed into her palm without explanation days before, and set its edge against her own palm, and felt, even before the metal bit, the wood itself lean toward her like something starved. The first drops fell dark onto the stone. Where they touched, faint silver threads kindled along the old cracks, fragile as spider silk, and the mist recoiled a handspan. Warmth answered from the mark hidden at her wrist, climbing her arm, and for one trembling moment she thought, I can do this. I am doing this. Stop. Idris's voice cracked across the grove like a branch snapping underfoot, and he was already moving, already past the outer stones before she could rise, his face carved into something desperate and furious in the moon's cold light. You don't understand what you're doing. You'll unravel the last of it, not mend it. I know exactly what I'm doing." Her voice did not shake now. She pressed her bleeding palm flat against the stone as he closed the distance, and the silver threads guttered, straining against his nearness the way a candle strains against wind. "Don't. Idris, please, whatever you believe about me, don't. I believe you're going to finish what your mother started and get yourself killed in this grove exactly as she did," he said, and there was something raw beneath the anger now, something almost like grief, and I will not stand in Corvin's lodge again and watch him break himself over a Fenwick woman bleeding out for a legacy she never asked for. He lunged for the journal, for the blade, for anything he could tear away from her before the right could root, and the half-formed threads of silver light shuddered under the sudden violence of it, flickering toward dark, and the mist surged back in from every side of the ring like a held breath finally let go. Chapter 9. The bond had never gone quiet before. Even when Corvin was half a county away on pack business, even when sleep took him under and dreams scattered his thoughts to nonsense, he had always felt marigold somewhere at the edge of himself, a low warm hum like a hearth banked for the night. He had grown so used to it that he no longer noticed it the way a man does not notice his own heartbeat until the moment it stopped. He was standing in the lodge yard arguing with two of the younger wolves about watch rotations when the warmth simply guttered, as though someone had opened a door onto a winter field. His chest went cold so fast, he actually pressed a hand to his sternum, certain for one absurd instant that he had been struck. The younger wolves fell silent, watching his face change, and later they would tell the others that the alpha's eyes had gone gold and wild in a heartbeat. No warning at all, no words. He was simply gone, over the fence and into the trees before anyone could ask what was wrong. He ran the way he had not run in years, not since he was a half-grown pup racing his littermates for the joy of the wind in his fur, except there was no joy in it now, only a single word repeating itself under every heartbeat. Marigold, marigold, marigold. The moon hung high and merciless white above the canopy, throwing bars of light and black shadow across the forest floor, and he took them at a dead sprint, four-footed and low, ears flat, faster than sense, faster than safety, because the bond in his chest had gone from cold to hollow, and hollow was the sound a thing made right before it broke. He smelled the grove before he saw it, old stone and crushed herbs, and underneath it, unmistakably, the copper tang of her blood, and beneath that, worse, the sour thread of Idris's fury woven through the mist like a stain. Corvin burst through the last stand of birches and skidded to a halt on the ring's edge, chest heaving, and what he saw nearly stopped his heart outright. The wardstones stood in their broken circle, half of them still dark, and between them threads of silver light writhed and snapped like something caught in a trap, straining toward Marigold's outstretched, bleeding hand and failing to reach her, torn apart again and again by the violence surging off Idris, where he grappled for the journal in her lap. She was on her knees in the wet grass, swaying, her face gone the color of old ash, one hand pressed flat to the central stone and the other closing weakly around the blade she would not let go of even as Idris's fingers dug into her wrist. Idris. Corvin's voice came out of him in a register he did not recognize, something low and cracking with an authority older than words, older than the pack itself, and every wolf who had ever heard an alpha's true voice would have gone to their belly at the sound of it. Idris did not. Idris turned his head, eyes wide and wild, grief and terror tangled together behind the anger. Corvin, get her out of here. Look what it's doing to her. Let go of her. Corvin was already moving, already across the ring, and he did not remember covering the distance, Only that one moment he was at the tree line, and the next his hands were closing over Idris's shoulder and hauling him back and away with a strength that sent the other man sprawling into the wet grass beyond the stones. Idris scrambled up, breathing hard, and for one terrible moment Corvin thought he would come again, thought he would have to choose between his beta and his mate in the one place in the world where such a choice should never have to be made. But Idris only stood there, chest heaving, staring at Marigold's slumped shoulders with an expression that had stopped being anger somewhere in the last few minutes and become something closer to horror at himself. There was no time to reckon with that now. Corvin dropped to his knees at Marigold's side, and the moment his hands closed over hers on the stone, he understood exactly what Idris's interference had done. The threads of silver were guttering low, the right half-rooted and unable to finish, and Marigold's strength was pouring out of her into a working that had nowhere left to go, wasted against the broken weave like water poured into cracked earth. Marigold. Her eyes found him, glassy, distant, and it frightened him more than any wound he had ever taken in battle. "Look at me. I'm here." "I have to finish it," she whispered, the words slurring at the edges. "If I stop now, it's worse than never starting," Sable said. "It has to close all the way around or it. Then we finish it together." He did not know, in that moment, whether such a thing was even possible, whether a bond forged by fate could be bent to carry a warden's right, but he had spent his whole life trusting his instincts in a fight, and every instinct in him now said pour yourself into her, hold nothing back, so he did. He wrapped both his hands fully around her bleeding one, pressing her palm harder against the stone, and he opened himself along the bond the way he had never dared to before, not carefully, not gently, but completely, offering everything he had, his strength, his will, the fierce, unyielding love he had been too proud and too frightened to name aloud, and let it pour down the silver thread between their hearts and out through her hand into the dying wardstone. The grove answered. Light did not so much return as detonate, silver and gold both, flooding out from the central stone in a ring that raced outward to every fallen marker at once, and where it touched each broken stone flared alive, like a coal breathed back to flame. The mist that had crowded in from every side did not merely retreat. It burned away entirely, in threads of pale fire that rose into the branches and winked out like sparks going up a chimney. Marigold cried out, a sound caught somewhere between pain and release, and her spine arched as the last of the right rooted itself through her and into the earth and the stones and the whole listening wood beyond, binding wild toward it the way it had not been bound in a generation. Then it was over, and the grove stood hushed and gleaming, every wardstone lit from within with a low steady glow like banked coals, and the air itself smelled suddenly, achingly clean, of rain-washed pine and turned earth, of a forest exhaling after holding its breath too long. Marigold slumped forward, and Corvin caught her before she struck the ground, gathering her against his chest, his hand finding the pulse at her throat, and nearly weeping at how strong and steady it beat there, tired but whole. "I have you," he murmured into her hair, over and over, not entirely sure whether he was telling her or himself. "I have you, you did it, I have you." It was the sound of running feet and low urgent voices that made him lift his head, Sable first, moving faster than her age should allow, and behind her a dozen pack wolves who had felt the Grey-Wither's grip vanish from their own bones all at once, and had come running toward the light blazing up through the trees. They stopped at the grove's edge and took in the scene entire. The mended stones, the healer cradled in their alpha's arms, and Idris standing apart in the wet grass with the journal still clutched forgotten in one hand, and the truth of what he had done written plain across his stricken face. Chapter 10. The full moon rose over Hollow with the color of warm honey, and by the time it cleared the black lace of the treetops, every soul of the Hollowmere pack had gathered in the lodge clearing to welcome it. Lanterns hung strung between the pines, swaying gently, and a bonfire taller than any marigold had seen roared at the clearing's heart, throwing sparks up toward the stars like small bright wishes let loose. The scent of wood smoke and roasting chestnuts and crushed pine needles hung sweet in the cool autumn air, and somewhere beyond the ring of firelight, fiddles and a low hand drum were tuning themselves into a tune that made her feet want to move before she had even decided to dance. Weeks had passed since the grove had blazed white and mended itself beneath her hands, weeks in which the wardstones had settled into their old quiet strength and the gray wither had not returned even once, not so much as a tremor in the youngest pups. Idris was gone, cast out by the Pack Council's unanimous judgment, his name already fading from the Pack's daily speech the way frost fades once the sun climbs high enough. Sable said such things healed the way the wood itself healed, slowly and then all at once, and looking around her now at the laughing, easy faces of the pack, Marigold believed her. She stood at the edge of the fire's light in a gown the color of ripening wheat. One Sable and the pack's women had stitched for her over the past fortnight with a fussing, teasing tenderness that had left her half laughing and half in tears more than once, and she smoothed her hands down the soft fabric now, feeling suddenly shy in a way she had not felt since she was a girl. Her hair had been braided through with sprigs of late aster and silver ribbon, and at her wrist, plain for anyone to see now, the moon-pale mark that matched the one at Corvin's collarbone caught the firelight and seemed almost to glow. "You look," said a voice warm against her ear, "like something the wood grew on purpose, just to spite the rest of us for being ordinary." She turned, and there he was, Corvin, dressed in dark green and gray, his hair combed back though a piece of it had already begun to fall loose over his brow the way it always did, and his eyes, when they found hers, held that same startled tenderness she had first seen in him weeks ago in her cottage, only now there was no fear in it at all, only certainty. "You're one to talk," she said, standing there looking like an alpha. "I am an alpha." "Well, there you are, then." She laughed, and he caught her hand and drew it to his lips, and the old warmth that had first flooded her chest the night she bound his wounds moved through her again, steadier now, familiar, like a hearth fire banked low and constant rather than a sudden blaze. Sable came to gather them then, moving through the crowd with the easy authority of a woman who had buried 2 generations of this pack's sorrows and lived to dance at its joys as well, and behind her the whole clearing seemed to hush and turn, faces bright in the firelight, waiting. She took Marigold's free hand in one of hers and Corvin's in the other, and drew them both toward the great flat warding stone that stood just outside the fire's ring, the same kind of stone, weathered and moon-pale, that Marigold had touched with her own blood in the grove not so very long ago. "Alpha Corvin of Hollowmere," Sable said, her old voice carrying easy and clear over the crackle of the flames. "Do you take this woman, Warden of the Old Blood, Healer of Thistlewick, as your mate before the pack and the moon and the wood that made you both?" "I do," Corvin said, and there was no hesitation in it at all, only a low fierce gladness that made something in Marigold's chest ache sweetly. "I have from the first night she put her hands on me, and I felt the whole world tilt toward her." A ripple of soft laughter moved through the gathered pack, warm rather than mocking, and Sable turned to Marigold next, her eyes bright with old tears not yet fallen. "And you, Marigold Fenwick, daughter of a warden line near lost to us, will you stand as this pack's own, bound to its alpha and to the wood he guards, now and for all the turning years to come?" Marigold looked at Corvin, at the firelight moving gold across the strong planes of his face, at the mark upon his skin that answered the one upon her own, and she thought of her mother, who had walked this same wood alone and unknown, who had died carrying a secret she never got to pass down in words, only in blood. She thought that somewhere, if the old magic was kind, her mother could see this. The ward stones singing quiet in the dark, the gray wither stilled, her daughter no longer standing outside the firelight, but wrapped up entirely within it. "I will," she said, and her voice did not shake at all. "I've been looking for this place my whole life without knowing its name. I know it now." Corvin drew her against him then, one broad hand spread warm at the small of her back, and when he kissed her the whole clearing rose up around them in a great swell of sound, cheering and stamping, and the fiddles breaking gladly into their tune at last. And somewhere at the edges of the firelight the younger wolves could not help themselves and tipped their heads back and howled, long and glad and rising, until one by one the rest of the pack took up the sound, voices and howls twining together under the vast clear moon like two threads of the same old rope pulled taut and true. Marigold laughed against Corvin's mouth, dizzy with the joy of it, and when he lifted his head to look at her, his eyes were bright as the fire itself. "No more lonely nights at the tree line," he murmured, just for her, beneath the noise of the celebration. "No more standing at the edge of things wondering where you belong." "No," she agreed, tipping her brow to rest against his. "I belong right here." Behind them the ward stones stood dark and steady and silent in their long circle through the trees, holding the wood's peace the way they had for generations before her and would for generations after, and around them the pack's howls climbed higher still, joyful and unafraid, carrying out over the moonlit tops of Hollowwood toward a horizon grown calm and clean and whole. Marigold closed her eyes and listened to it, to the fire's crackle and the fiddle's sweetness and the low steady drum of Corvin's heart beneath her cheek, and felt, for the first time in all her remembering, entirely and completely home.
The end.
Thank you for listening to The Warden of Hollowmere. If you enjoyed this story, a new full-length audiobook in the Moonlit Bonds series arrives every week. Until next time, good night.